The haunting thoughts of the young Englishman go on, as he sets sail for a remote area in the South Atlantic island, to work as a meteorologist. While his thoughts drown him down, Captain Axel approaches him and lights a cigarette, telling him that they're almost there. In September 1914, they finally arrive on the island, where no one greets them. The man had been sent to replace another meteorologist stationed at the island, but there seems to be no sign of anyone. Captain Axel accompanies the young man to look for the previous meteorologist to ensure he's safe. They come across a lighthouse and knock on it, but no one answers. The young man forces the door open and finds the only other person on the island, Gruner the signal technician, who greets them both coldly. When Captain Axel asks about the former weather official Gruner, he answers that the man they're looking for died from typhus. Gruner seems unbothered by their presence and walks around naked. Irritated, Captain Axel and the young man leave the lighthouse. When Captain Axel bids him goodbye, the man wanders around the island as he deems life ahead of him. Like the previous weather official, he must dwell in the intensity and direction of the winds for 12 months, before someone replaces him. When he returns to the cabin to fix his things, he finds the previous meteorologist's diary, revealing his name as Alder. Inside, he sees sketches, a photograph of Alder's wife, and even a lighthouse drawing with strange creatures beside it. The next morning, he finds strange rock circles on the sand. He then heads near the coast with the telescope to start work. As he peeks through the binoculars, he sees the naked man doing a stretch as preparation for a long day of doing nothing. That night while he's reading, he hears rustling outside his door, to which he thinks is Gruner. However, the noises get louder and louder with scratching and growling. Then suddenly a reptilian hand appears at the bottom of the door, which he immediately steps on, causing the unknown creature to get agitated. When he hears more, he hides under the floorboards while they try to enter his cabin. They attack his place but notice that there's no one inside. When the footsteps stop, he looks through a small hole in the floorboards door. The creature peeps through as well, causing him to poke its eye with a knife. Feeling afraid, he locks himself underground for the whole night. He calls Gruner the next day, pleading to be let into the lighthouse, but Gruner refuses, determined to fight. He heads back home and spends the whole day reinforcing it with a newfound rifle. The man feels ready to fight against the unknown monsters. The night comes and the swarm of beasts start appearing from the darkness, slowly approaching the cabin. He braces himself as he shoots them one by one. He eventually has no choice but to start a fire, since there are simply too many to handle. The fire makes them flee, but it burns the cabin. He runs away from his burning house. Fortunately, it rains before the cabin completely burns down. The following day he sees Gruner leave the lighthouse and discreetly follows him down to the rocks. When he is about to ambush Gruner, a blue female sea creature attacks him and he points his gun at her. However, Gruner stops him from shooting her by showing she is vulnerable. The young man takes advantage of offering Gruner some of his supplies in return for shelter. Gruner then calls Fred for the sea creature to acknowledge him. Later they head into Fred's cabin to gather his supplies. He realizes that the previous weather official didn't die from typhus, but from the sea creatures. However, Gruner tells him that they need to head back to the lighthouse since it's nearing sunset, and the creatures might attack. They lift the supplies into the beacon, and after a long walk, Fred passes out. One morning Fred is awakened by the female sea creature, licking his hand trying to heal his burns. It turns out that he's been asleep for 2 days. Fred finds Gruner and takes an inventory of their ammunition and explains to him that the creature, which he calls a toad, is like a dog who will not abandon her master, no matter how cruel he is. Fred gazes at her, fascinated by her existence, giving her the impression that she's different from the others, but Gruner warns him not to trust her entirely, believing that her quiet and calm personality hides evil intentions. Gruner then shows Fred more of the lighthouse and takes him up to the top. Fred wonders why Gruner chose to stay on the island when he had the opportunity to leave, when Fred arrived. But Gruner tells him that he will never come back to the civilized world, now that he is the master of his own destiny. Still, Fred tells Gruner that he will come aboard when he sees the next ship come by, to which Gruner wishes him good luck. Later that day, he contemplates how a few days of isolation recently have changed him, as he fixes his things. He's surprised by the creature's presence, but still, he observes her as she ignorantly eats a candle. As he's trying to explain to her the use of a candle, Gruner calls him up, commanding him to bring his rifle. That night, Fred watches Gruner as he prepares for the attack. The older man instructs him what to do and fires the flare gun, which signals the beginning of a long night. On the other hand, while the female creature wails into the sky, a crowd of sea creatures watches. The following day, Gruner is enraged at Fred's ineffectiveness, telling him to fetch water instead. Fred gets the water, and when he comes back, He hears a pounding and wailing in Gruner's room, and to his surprise, he sees Gruner thrusting himself into the sea creature. He then immediately leaves. Later that day, Gruner and Fred eat lunch in awkward silence. Fred cannot confront him as he feels guilty and uncomfortable at the same time. However, Gruner breaks the tension as he bangs the table, telling Fred that he has one last chance left that night. Gruner catches the attention of the creatures as he takes the flare gun when the monsters appear. Gruner falls asleep. As the sun rises, Gruner is surprised to see Fred alive, covered in blood, gazing blankly at him. Months pass, and the two men get into a routine, when the creatures attack several nights in a row, forcing them to stay alert. Days are always the same, but nights are getting longer, and only nature keeps them sane. They manage to coexist, where Fred's everyday task is to fetch water while the Gruner maintains their weapon. One day, Fred speculates that the creatures are returning to the lighthouse to reclaim the female sea creature, but he still wonders why she allows her species to get killed, and why they don't attack some nights. Gruner doesn't care why the creatures come, and plans to exterminate them all. Later on, Fred visits his old faded cabin to reclaim some of his belongings, only to discover how he has changed his appearance. As he looks at himself in a mirror and trims his beard, hoping to have some sense of his old self. On his way back to the lighthouse, he comes across a massive whale skeleton and picks up a piece. Still, there are no attacks that night, making him believe that the laws between the battles are often worse than the battles themselves. But they take advantage of this to prepare for the next attack. While Fred wanders around, he sees the creature and approaches her for the first time. As he touches her cold skin, he grows to like the strange being and gives her the name Inerus, while Gruner uses her for his ends as a servant and sex slave. One evening, Gruner invites Fred to play chess, and as they play, the young man shares his observations and hypotheses on the existence of sea creatures. However, Gruner asks him to shut his mouth and play, urging Fred to perform a checkmate. Gruner then picks up his gun and points it in the young man's direction as he perceives a creature behind his back. It turns out the sea monsters are already on the attack. They run into the higher point of the lighthouse as more and more monsters arrive. They fight with their rifles but are getting overwhelmed as the attack was too sudden, but still decide to go up to the lantern pane where the light illuminates. Unfortunately, Gruner is badly bitten as they flee. Gruner sings a tragic love song until the sun rises, and the monsters leave that morning. Inerus takes care of Gruner's bent foot, as she sticks her tongue into the wound. They cannot survive another war as they are running out of supply and ammunition. Later that day, Fred perceives a ship from the distance while he roams. He immediately runs inside to get the flare gun, afraid of having no one to hate. Gruner restrains Fred as he's about to shoot, pinning him to the ground. Inerus tries to protect Fred, which enrages Gruner, causing him to walk out with the flare gun. Feeling frustrated, Fred yells at Gruner, telling him that he's afraid to be left behind and fight alone. A little while later, Fred finds a way to communicate with Inerus by showing her a boat that he carved out of bone, hoping that she would understand. Inerus then leads him to an abandoned rowboat on the shore away from the lighthouse. At the lighthouse, the young man tells Gruner about the boat, but Gruner says he knows about it, informing him that a Portuguese man used it to get away from a shipwreck, but the creatures killed him. He also claims that the ship's cargo contained dynamite, but he assumes that they're all waterlogged. Meanwhile, Fred is interested in diving into the shipwreck with an atmospheric diving suit, but Gruner disapproves, telling Fred that what he's proposing is a suicide mission. One afternoon, the young man paints the rowboat in hopes of making it work. He then hears a howl in the distance, only to find Inerus enjoying a swim nearby. As he removes his clothes, he slowly approaches her as if he's going to kiss her. Gruner is watching back at the lighthouse while Fred is reading a book. Gruner hands him a diving suit and changes his mind after witnessing what they did in the pool, secretly hoping Fred will die in the attempt due to jealousy. The following day, they row out to the shipwreck using the boat. The young man explains a rope tug is their only way to communicate, while their Fred is underwater, telling Gruner that he will tug the rope 3 times if he needs air supply. He then wears an old diving suit and searches for the crates carrying dynamite, while Gruner controls the string from the boat. While underwater, Fred finds the container and immediately hooks them up. After hooking up several small boxes, Fred finds an infant sea creature peeking through his suit, causing him to fall. He pulls the rope and starts to panic as more creatures surround him. Gruner is just watching the rope on the verge of abandoning Fred, but as the young man releases himself from the suit and swims up into the boat, Gruner immediately helps him up. When they return home, they immediately check the crate and discover that only one box among the others contains explosives. Fred and Gruner devised a plan to entice as many creatures as possible into the lighthouse, before detonating the planted dynamite in hopes of scaring them away. But that night no one attacked. 3 weeks pass in the blink of an eye, and Gruner is getting impatient. While waiting for the big attack, Fred finds Gruner freezing outside, still waiting in desperation for the creatures. He asks him to go inside and defuse the detonator for a while. One time Fred and Gruner are waiting for Inaris's catch for their lunch, but when Gruner discovers that she brought starfish instead of fish, he kicks her and blames her for telling her kind about their plan to scare them. The angry man grabs Fred's shirt, telling them that their new plan is to leave the door open, luring them inside for an ambush that night. While watching it, the grunt takes the upper ground, preparing to detonate the dynamite. They've been waiting for hours, and it seems like they're not going to attack them. Following Fred's speculation, Gruner drags Inaris beside him, forcing her to wail, assuming that it would attract the creatures. Meanwhile, a sea creature attacks Fred at the main door. He manages to get away from them, but more creatures are coming in. He rushes upstairs while informing Gruner that they're now inside the lighthouse. The creatures attack, but Gruner cannot detonate the explosives, causing Fred to sprint to the top of the lighthouse and reconnect the detonator. An explosion occurs, killing many sea creatures and leaving them feeling unsatisfied. Gruner goes for a second set of explosives nearer to the lighthouse, knocking Fred and himself out. When Fred wakes up the following day, he immediately searches for Gruner and wakes him up. The young man is relieved when Gruner moves and starts singing a song, which he joins this time. Meanwhile, there is massive chaos around the beacon. Gruner uses a spear to finish off the wounded and dying toad on the beach. After seeing one of the dead creatures wearing a necklace, Fred believes that the species are more civilized than Gruner portrays them. Gruner grabs the pendant and hurls it into the sea, feeling enraged. Later that evening, while they watch for the next attack, Fred hears Inaris and several other creatures mourning the loss of their species. Gruner approaches him and explains that he rescued Inaris as a baby trapped in a net years ago, believing she owes him her life. Inaris vanishes, but Gruner assures him that she will crawl back as she always does. Fred seems to regret what they did, but Gruner remains cold and has no remorse towards the creature's death. One morning, Fred circles the stones in the sand and places the carved bone in the middle, hoping to get rescued. On the other hand, Gruner is still preparing for an explosion to continue scaring away the beasts, but there is still no attack that evening. As Fred fixed Gruner's mess, while the old man slept, he discovered a wedding photo of Gruner with the words "Love, Love, Love" written on the back. He recognized that the woman in the image was the same as the woman in the diary, realizing that Gruner is the former weather official and that Gruner isn't entirely void of human compassion. As a result, Fred erased his day counting as he understood everything was forgotten, including the very reason for his visit to work. There was no work done other than to stay alive. He then went into his shorts to remove the carved boat, when a sea creature suddenly approached him. Behind the child is a Inaris who appears more confident and bolder with her troops. Fred notices that they want a truce, but Gruner does not, and only wants Inaris back, which she refuses. Suddenly, Gruner fires a flare at the child, fatally striking him in the chest. Inaris looks at Fred with doubt and disappointment, leaving him alone as Gruner continues to fire at them. Fred pursues him, and after a struggle, throws him onto the ground and stabs his leg. Enraged, Gruner stands and gains the upper hand, and tries to murder him with an axe. But Fred calls him by his real name and tells him that he's not a murderer. Gruner comes to a pause, drops his axe, and utters "Love, Love, Love" as if the man has regained his former self. He goes outside and looks at the starry night, where the sea creatures slaughter him. A few months later, the next ship arrives to bring over Fred's replacement. The captain mistakenly calls him Gruner upon witnessing a shocking state of existence, which he doesn't bother to correct. Gruner leaves Fred with an unwavering legacy of taking his place. The young man keeps his place, thinking that this is the peace that he was looking for. The new Gruner stands by the balcony, staring at several boats, while Inaris runs into the sea, where she swims freely. Ending the movie.